election day, Israeli voters do not vote for individual members of the Knesset, they vote for a closed party list. So there is no personal connection in the Israeli electoral process between the voter and the political party. And normally, countries, states that use an electoral system like that, South Africa, Spain, are some of the more obvious democratic examples, if you will, tend to generate and create very strong, cohesive political parties, very disciplined political parties. Why? Because ultimately candidates and legislators owe their job, owe their position in the legislature, in the Knesset, to the particular position that they received on the candidate list. If you disobey the party, chances are that you are not going to be getting a favorable or realistic spot on, in the next election on the candidate list. Now, of course, this gets a little bit more nuanced in the Israeli context, less so in South Africa and less so in Spain, by virtue of the fact that a growing number of political parties on a growing number of occasions in Israel actually run internal candidate elections. And that means that within the political parties, think of Likud, think of Avodah, they actually, within the party itself, there is a growing development of a personal connection and a personal reputation seeking on the part of the candidates. If you have to compete internally within the party to get on a realistic spot on the candidate list, then actually the power of the party over your placement is going to be weaker. And it's not surprising to see that over the last 2.5 decades, when the number and the frequency of intra-party candidate elections have actually increased, we actually did start seeing more and more problems with legislative defections and party switching in the Knesset as well. So what I would like to do today, so that's one important reason then why we need to worry about, sorry to go back, about the politics of defections in Israel. Another important reason, this is just to contextualize the talk in a particular way, has to do with some of the really powerful political implications and consequences that some of the most high-profile defections led to. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time on highlighting some of these for various reasons, but you can see the smiley picture of Moshe Dayan at the bottom of the page. Of course, one of the very interesting, very prominent high-profile defectors who shortly, literally days after the 1977 election, after having spent all of his political career in the Israeli left, actually crosses the floor, becomes an independent, a single-member MK for much of the legislature, but he does this in order to join Menachem Begin's government. And of course, you can run a counterfactual exercise to think about how the peace process could have unfolded, had Dayan not made that particular move. And of course, the same applies to Ariel Sharon's famous defection and splitting of Likud with the formation of Kadima, which also resulted in, of course, major political decisions such as the withdrawal from Gaza. And you could also think about the passage of Oslo II, which I'm going to speak about a little bit later, which in large measure was thanks to a small group of 3 defectors that allowed the Rabin government to actually pass this very controversial and difficult piece of agreement. So what I would like to do then is to...
Well,
yes, no. As we said, you can certainly eat. I certainly don't want to spend in the way of your... I want to make sure that your intellectual appetite is put at ease by the part. In the meantime, your physical appetite can be taken care of by the bosses, so we can certainly pass these around. Thanks so much, Jennifer. So what I would like to do then is really to tease out some of the important differences in the structures, the political structures of some of these defections. Then I'm going to look at the ways in which the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, actually try to address and tackle the problem. And towards the end of the talk, I'm going to show you some numbers, nothing grueling, just very basic pieces of stats to show you and give you a sense of whether these legislative attempts to curb in defections actually have succeeded or not. So the reason why I put Dayan's picture on the front page and why I included Dayan's picture in the presentation has to do with highlighting the fact that even though the Israeli electoral and party system is very party-centered and party-based, you do see on occasion, and some of these are more higher profile than others, you do see on occasion individual members of Knesset individual politicians actually trying to run it on their own, to actually defect from a party, either joining another one or trying to form a new political movement, a new political party on their own, which under the Israeli electoral system is not that difficult to do because the threshold to get through the barrier of representation is fairly low. Now, of course, Dayan's case was a very interesting example of such a lone wolf or a single MK defection. If you look at a more recent example, just to the right of Dayan's picture on the front page, you will see a more recent example, quite well known in journalistic circles, much less studied in the academy, even though it should be because it highlights very interesting novelties in the processes of defections, has to do with the 2011 split in the Labour Party. And what was interesting about the split is that the split wasn't actually carried out by junior backbenchers of the party, but it was the leader of the party, Ehud Barak, who was sitting in Netanyahu's cabinet at the time as defense minister, who actually took with himself 4 other members of the party's caucus, and formed a new political party, Ha'atzmaut, or independence. So you could ask a number of questions: why a party leader actually defects from his party when he is in power? You can ask the question why he took with himself 4 rather than 3, rather than 6 members of the party. All of these are important questions, especially the latter one. No. And it immediately highlights to us a very important change in Israeli legislation, which makes lone wolf or single MK defections very, very difficult and encourages defections to take the shape of outright party splits, which of course destabilizes the party system in an interesting way. If you turn the page, you will see a nice smiley picture of 2 gentlemen, Victor Kahalani on the left and Ehud Barak on the right, soon after the formation of Ha'atzmaut. And that particular moment, the meeting between the two, actually highlights another complication of the ways in which party splits are addressed and treated under Israeli law. Ehud Barak very quickly found that even though he formed a new political party, if he wanted to run in the next election, it will not be so simple, because he would have to go through a somewhat demanding process of registering that political party, which includes meeting a number of administrative criteria, such as creating a party constitution, lining up a certain number of party members, and also, of course, creating some kind of a financial fiscal base on which the party can be run. There was a way around that, and the way around that also highlights very important development in Israeli legislation relating to political parties and their unity. And the way around that, the way which allowed Barak to actually run, in the end he decided not to run in the election, but if he had wanted to, was to take advantage of what is called in Israel a shelved political party. Kahalani formed quite some time previously to that a smaller political party called the Third Way, which after a while stopped running in Israeli elections, but remained on the books of the Israeli party registry. And that meant that think of a company essentially taking advantage of another company's institutional framework. And that's exactly what Barak did. Barak said, well, if Kahalani agrees, we are essentially just going to put our name on the institutional skeleton of the Third Way. We don't have to go through a whole new issue of party registration. And we would be able to, if he agrees, we would be able to take advantage of the money, the fiscal assets that are already accumulated by that previous political party, and registration doesn't have to be doesn't have to involve anything more than that. Interestingly enough, literally at the same time, Tzipi Livni had to do exactly the same as she was leaving Kadima and was forming her own new political party, Havlua, which imposed itself, if you will, on the institutional skeletal framework of on Hetz, another former centrist political party. So you can appreciate that while party splits and defection do take place in Israel, they can take place in Israel, they do involve a number of legal ramifications, which of course is something that strategic political actors have to take into account and have to keep in mind as they design their strategies about staying with the party or not. Now, in order to make sense of the Israeli story, I did want to say, really in the next 2 slides, did want to draw your attention to a couple of analytical points, which I think is going to be helpful for us as we move along. First of all, a definition. Of course, you shouldn't have comparative analytic discussion without actually defining what you want to be talking about, what you want to be examining. So the conventional definition of party switching and party hopping in the comparative legislative literature is on the next slide. It's a voluntary change in the partisan affiliation of elected member of parliament, elected legislative body. Well, if that is the definition, then we can really distinguish a number of different forms that such behavior can take. And as I mentioned, you can think about Moshe Dayan, who is leaving his parent party and becomes an independent. You can think about Ehud Barak, who is leaving his parent party and is forming a new political party. You can think about a voluntary change in legislators' partisan affiliation taking the shape of a merger, a fusion, and these have all very different impacts on how fragmented the legislative party system is going to be. Sometimes voluntary changes in partisan affiliations of legislators leads to the creation of bigger political parties, sometimes smaller political parties. And these, of course, will have important repercussions for the types of laws that can be or cannot be passed, how stable governments are going to be or are going not to be. Now, because of the problematic nature, because defections really don't jive, because party hopping doesn't really square well with the institutional logic of the Israeli party system, as I mentioned earlier, the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, since 1990 has actually taken a number of very stringent steps trying to legislate this behavior. So such anti-defection or anti-party hopping laws are of course not unique to Israel, but they are not very prevalent either. And there is a certain sense in which political theorists and jurists, and there is a very important body of legal wisdom and legal opinion that we have in the literature about the issue, suggesting that that the mandate of the elected legislator in any country should be free, and the mandate is primarily there to make sure that whoever sits in parliament can, without constraints, represent the views of the constituency. And any kind of imposition on the view, on the behavior of such an elected member by the political party really disturbs and interferes with that direct link between the constituency, whether that be district-based or at large, and the member of parliament.
Can I just ask you to go over the types of switching very briefly? Some of them seem to be perhaps equivalent to others, so could you just define?
No, so the only point there, Stanley, is that and the reason why you have them on a continue, that as you move towards the left, those types of party switches lead to more fragmented legislatures. So a split, for example, that's the Barak example. You have the Labour Party splitting into two. And as you move towards the right, and you have fusion, when a number of existing smaller political parties are creating a larger entity.
And the others are in between, like those extremes.
That's right. That's right. Now, let me continue by saying a few words about 1998. Of course, 1998 and the Knesset that gets elected then is very, very important, because that's when the first major legislation pertaining to party switching gets introduced. Now, in the history of party hopping in Israel, in the history of the Knesset, really goes back right to the very beginning. Like right at the very start, in the first Knesset, you had a small number, but still very important members of that legislature changing sides. You have on the left Eliezer Preminger, who gets actually expelled from his Communist Party. And the Communist Party demanded that he leaves the Knesset because they no longer liked. This is on page 2. Yeah. And this is at the bottom. At the bottom.
Yeah.
And although the party demanded that he should quit from the Knesset, he doesn't. Instead, he forms a new political party called the Hebrew Communists. And before the Knesset would be dissolved, he actually joined Mapam. Moshe Sneh, similarly in the second Knesset, is a very high-profile defector who actually moves the other way from the Mapam list. He initially forms a small formation called the left faction, and eventually ends up finishing the legislative term as member of the Communist Party, and then he actually runs a very successful political legislative career thereafter. And Yitzhak Harari, Ben Gurion, of course Ben Gurion's splitting from the Labour Party and the creation of Rafi is also a celebrated example. So there really the point is just to tell you that there really have been a number of very important cases of party hops in the Israeli legislature prior to 1988. Yet, when you ask any Israeli legislator or any scholar or student of Israeli legislative politics what they know about, what they think about party hopping, if you go on the website of the Israeli Knesset and if you look for information of party switching, the Israeli term that you will find being associated with this behavior has actually nothing to do with national politics. The name that you will find is kalanterism, a term that is associated with a local Jerusalem politician, Rahamim Kalanter, who in the mid-1950s, in 1955 as a matter of fact, crossed the floor in the Jerusalem City Council in order to save the office of Mayor Gershon Agron. Gershon Agron had a very tight, narrow majority, a 1% majority in the 21-member Jerusalem City Council, and two religious parties were part of this coalition, and these religious parties very much opposed the idea that landed before the coalition, the idea of granting or not a permit to build a Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem on King David Street. And Mayor Agron was very much in favor of the proposal. He thought it would be a very good time and a very good opportunity to make sure that the religious diversity of the city would advance. He certainly used his connections with the American Jewish community to propagate this development, but the Orthodox parties in the coalition opposed, and in fact, they left the coalition over these issues and submitted a motion of no confidence against Agron. Agron needed one vote to save him, and that was Rahamim Kalanter, a junior rookie politician from the Buhari community of Jerusalem, and who barely got into the city council. He was the last ranked on from among the realistic spots on the Mizrahi list. So Kalanter crosses the floor. In return for that, he actually gets inducted and appointed to be member of Agron's city cabinet, looking after the religious affairs portfolio and also sanitation. Not suggesting that there is a connection between the two, but the important thing to point out is that he got an executive payoff. He got not just a handshake from Agron, he actually got executive power for showing disloyalty to the party. So Kalanterism, since then, is the dirty word associated with this particular type of behavior. When a member of the legislature, the national level, a member of the Knesset actually leaves the party that got him or her elected and gets an office portfolio in exchange. You can think, and some people argue, that Barak's move in 2011 was a kalanteristic move, because after all, when he split from Avodah, when he split from the Labour Party, he did so in large measure to remain member of the Netanyahu cabinet, because the rest of the Labour Party immediately left the coalition. So it's an interesting reverse kalanterism, if you will. He didn't get a portfolio, he split and he left his parent party together with the other Labourites in order to keep himself in office. Now, in the Knesset elected in 1988, this particular phenomenon, kalanterism and party hopping, reaches the low point. And that low point is associated with the now, unfortunately, or fortunately, much forgotten event called the Hatargil HaMasriach, the stinking trick, which was the trick by the Israeli Labour Party, Shimon Peres in particular, to undermine the National Unity Agreement, National Unity Government that he had formed with Yitzhak Shamir. And the point of the stinking trick was to essentially get the Labour Party out of the National Unity Government together with Shas and at least one of the Ashkenazi Orthodox political parties, and try to form an alternative new government without a new election and excluding Shamir's Likud. In order to do that, of course, the cooperation of Shas would have been required, but also because there was a very narrow balance between left and right in that particular Knesset, Peres also had to engage and engineer a number of high-profile defections from the political right. Of course, Shamir, being the smart fox that he was, engaged in exactly the same thing. And what Israel was facing in the midterm through the Knesset was a very much exposed and publicized series of defections back and forth. Some of the major characters associated with that move, of course, are the 5 former members of Likud, former members of the Liberal Party, who formed the party for the advancement of the Zionist idea, led by former Finance Minister Modai, Ephraim Gur, leader of the Georgian Jewish, representative of the Georgian Jewish community, who also leaves the Labour Party in exchange for a realistic spot and a high spot, and also a junior cabinet position that Shamir promises him. Mizrahi from the Ashkenazi Orthodox world. So there were a large number of these defections, which actually were associated with, at the very pinnacle of political power in Israel, with government instability. Because when Peres pulls out of the National Unity Government, when he engages in the stinking trick, the Shamir government actually falls. For the first time, an Israeli government actually gets voted out of office on a vote of no confidence. And that was
This never happened before?
Never happened before. And that fact in and of itself, that a relatively small number of arguably dishonest, certainly enterprising members of Knesset could actually bring a government down, lend Kalantarism an even more dirtier nuance than it was before. Of course, what made things even more complicated is that Peres didn't succeed to form a new government, and Shamir was actually able to come back as a result of wooing back some of the defectors that Peres tried to and got with himself in the first place.
That was 1988?
That was in 1990. So it was so that the break and the from midterm through from the turn of the Knesset, the change happens. What came out of that was a major popular movement demanding political reform. It's difficult. And of course, if you weren't in Israel then, or if you weren't following political events, then it's hard to imagine now, because the Knesset doesn't attract much popular attention these days, certainly not on the scale. But you had over 100,000 people actually filling the lawns outside the Knesset, demanding that something need to be done to clean up the institutions of the state, because clearly the Knesset is not working. The governmental system isn't working. And responding to that, one of the first legislative measures that the government introduces and the Knesset, with a large consensus actually passes, is the Azrieli anti-defection law. It's important to know that it's out of this popular demand for change, for institutional reform, was born another important change, and that is the direct election of the Prime Minister, which of course Sharon in 2001 repeals and rescinds. But please remember that this period, 1988 to 1990, is really a period of major institutional decay, if you will, in Israeli politics, leading to a very, very pronounced and powerful popular demand for rectifying and making institutions work better. And so Israel passes the first anti-defection law, which is really a package of 4 major instruments. And the first one, this is on the next slide at the top of page 3. The first important element of the Israeli anti-defection package had to do with amending the basic law on the Knesset. And the basic law on the Knesset essentially, or the amendment to the basic law on the Knesset, essentially said that if a member of Knesset leaves his or her political party and soon thereafter doesn't give up his or her seat, without defining what soon actually means, then that person, that MK, will not be allowed to run in the next Knesset election on the list of any political party that is currently in the Knesset. In other words, giving a major disincentive for sitting political parties to woo other legislators away in the promise of and in the hope of getting them elected under a different list in the next system. Now, and there was a very important legal nuance to this, apart from the fact that soon wasn't actually defined either in the basic law or in subsequent legal interpretation. And that's something that even to this day, the lawyers in the Knesset are trying to get a clearer interpretation and views on. Another problematic part of the basic law, the amendment to the basic law of the Knesset, was the definition of what actually qualifies for leaving, seceding from your parent political party. Because some members of Knesset, and Mikhail Nudelman, for example, as I will mention later on, a very interesting example of that. What if a member of Knesset simply stops showing up for caucus meetings, stops voting with the political party, but doesn't actually say that he or she is leaving? What if there is no open declaration of defection, like in the case of Moshe Dayan? What if it's only a behavioral defection, but not an explicit stated one? So what the basic law did say is that seceding from your party includes, and that was a very difficult, legally difficult problem. It includes voting against your party on a vote of confidence, vote of no confidence, or on budgetary items. But the term includes, of course, doesn't exhaust all the various other ways in which one can be disloyal or unfaithful to the political party. And I'm mentioning that because that's another part of the basic law of Knesset today that the Knesset lawyers are trying to get a clearer interpretation and definition of. Okay, and the action package. And the basic law on the government was amended to say that a defector, a person who leaves his or her parent political party, cannot be appointed to serve in the government. So in other words, the kind of characteristic lures and invitations will not be allowed. This, of course, but let me jump around point number 3 because points number 2 and 3 actually led to a very interesting complication a couple of years after the passage of the anti-defection law. Point number 3, or item number 3 of the anti-defection amendment package, changed the Israeli elections law. And the change to the Israeli election law said that while it's true that according to the amendment of the basic law of the Knesset, somebody who secedes from his or her parent political party cannot run in the next election on an existing party list, there is an exception to that. If the split, if the secession, if the defection takes place according to certain criteria that the election law, now amended, allows. And the major exception that is allowed under the election law has to do with the famous 1/3 rule. In other words, if at least 1/3 of the membership of the caucus splits from the party that got them elected, then that's not considered defection, that's a legal split. Please rewind. That's why Ehud Barak needed 5 members of Avoda. Not 4 and 6, that's too many. And if you look at the number of splits that have taken place since, they are always on that cusp, if you will. Sharon had exactly 1/3 of Likud with him when he formed Kadima. Tzipi Livni had exactly 1/3 of Kadima with herself, although she was already outside of the Knesset, when Hatnuah was formed. The minimal nature, if you will, the minimally winning nature of these splits is, shows the often very brutal but very smart rationality of
We're talking about minimum 1/3, to be more than 1/3, obviously, no?
Minimum. Well, minimum. Yes,
You said
minimum
1/3 wouldn't be good, you said?
No, it can be good, but why bother?
No, but if there happen to be more, then
That's fine, that's fine. Although this can create also complications that I would come to, that I would like to comment later on. Let me just mention the actual problem. What if a party wants to get rid of one of its members? Right? What if a party actually wants to exclude, what if a party has more than 3 members and wants to get rid of one particular individual? And this was a case in Shinui. Paritsky was really giving a very difficult time to the Shinui leadership, and Shinui, well, but he didn't want to defect because one out of, and the party had at the time, I think, 13 seats. He didn't want to risk his political future. So, in an interesting legal twist, the Knesset House Committee said, well, in this case, why wouldn't the majority faction split from Paritsky? And that's exactly what happened. The majority faction was more than 1/3. Palitsky didn't defect. He remained true to the party that got himself elected. The rest of the party was. So that's also not clear in the law. Whether the 1/3 has, whoever, there has to be at least a 1/3, 2/3 split. And you can appreciate the complexity.
The majority takes the name. The majority takes the name.
Well, in that case, they didn't, because if they had taken the name, that they
would be in contravention.
yes.
They take the name with them.
And taking the name is certainly a very important part of this also. For example, when Barak split, what was the name of the party in that particular Knesset? Under what label did the Labour Party run in the election to the Knesset when Barak formed? It was Labour Party under the leadership or for the leadership of Ehud Barak. So the name of Barak was in the party list. So when Ha'atzmaut went to the Knesset committee and said, we would like to form a new political party, the Knesset committee said, well, wait a minute, how can you leave the Labour Party of Ehud Barak in the Knesset without Ehud Barak? Right? So then the party had to the faction had to change its name, so things get a little bit more complicated.
As they say only in Israel. This kind of shenanigans.
There are some African cases also.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, you have Trump towers that are not owned by Trump. So.
Very nice. Okay. A very topical example. Thanks, Csaba. And
Can a single member be half in one, half in the other? Like if you have
split allegiances.
no.
You can't
No,
invent it.
no. And the final element, the fourth leg of the anti-defection law package had to do with party finance. And essentially, so the party finance law, which initially was legislated in 1973, was amended also at this time. And that amendment said that anybody who falls into the category of defectors will not be able to continue drawing on party funding. So if anybody, unless there is a legal split, if anybody leaves his or her parent party, they stop getting the portion of the money that the parent party was entitled initially from the state, they will not get. So that's a clear financial disincentive against engaging in splitting. Now, as it was initially passed, the Israeli anti-defection package went through a number of later amendments, and I just wanted to highlight some of the major ones on the lower left box of page 3.
Could you just tell me just the years in which the basic laws were passed?
This was all in one package, 1990, yeah.
1990?
Yeah, so that's all in one package. Yeah. So the later amendment, the first major later amendment is the Yehud law. The Yehud was a political party that was formed by 3 defectors, or I shouldn't say defectors because they actually constituted exactly a little bit more than a third of the 8-member party Tzomet, which Rafi Eitan had formed in the next Knesset. Now, Yehud, this new political party, was formed by 3 junior rookie politicians. In fact, other than Raful, all the other 7 members of the party were rookie politicians. Nobody expected Tzomet to actually get so many seats, 8 seats. That's why the party was popularly called Raful and the 7 Dwarfs. And you see pictures in which actually they are identified that way. So Raful and the 7 Dwarfs split. 3 out of 8 was 1/3, so that was no problem. Why did they split? Well, there was an argument about ideologically the 3 of them being more aligned with the Labour parties and Rabin's attempts to handle the peace process. But in exchange for that, Rabin actually offered 2 junior cabinet positions to these 3 members. Gonen Segev was promised the energy portfolio,
Yes.
and Alex Goldfarb health.
Deputy minister.
Both of them were deputy.
No. Gonen Segev was a minister. Was minister?
I stand corrected. The 3rd member, however, Esther Salmovich, was offered nothing. Which is why, almost immediately when the deal is done, Salmovich wants to defect back to Tzomet. But the point of this was that the court got involved, and the court said that, well, according to our interpretation, Segev and Goldfarb are not allowed to enter the government because the basic law on the government, as it was amended just a couple of years previously, while it stated that defectors couldn't enter the government, it didn't explicitly state that people who engage in a legal split can enter the government. And everywhere else, that distinction was made clear. So our interpretation, the courts erred on the side of the more enlightened view of things, that well, if they leave the parent party, they should not be allowed to join the government. What was very interesting is that almost the entire Knesset pulled together against the courts on this. From left to right, the argument was that that wasn't our intention when we changed the law. So we clearly wanted to provide this exception. But in order to make it happen, the amendment to the basic law now needed to be re-amended. And in fact, that's what the Rabin government does, and the Yehud case actually leads to a very quick, early re-amendment of the basic law on the government, and which then explicitly states that if you engage in a legal split, you can join the government, and that's exactly what paves the way to Szeged and Goldfarb to do that. A law for David Tal is an important amendment because it highlights the continued importance of single-member defections. David Tal, a former member of Shas, but when he enters the Knesset, in which Kadima eventually gets formed by Ariel Sharon, he's part of a small three-member left-wing formation, Amechad, led by Amir Peretz. And Likud was trying to bring David Tal over, but according to a particular paragraph in the anti-defection law, even though one would have been 1/3 of the three-member Amechad faction, there was a paragraph in that law from 1990 which actually didn't allow a single member to do that. So there was a floor of at least 2 people having to engage in a legal split. So Gideon Sar essentially gets the coalition together, and they changed the law in order to make sure that when it comes to one particular member of a political party who disagrees with the other two on joining hands with another political party, then he can do so. Now, David Tal, in particular, was very adamant and very much opposed to Amir Peretz's charted course of joining and actually formally entering the Labour Party. So there was actually a party merger talk that David Tal disagreed with. But under the existing law, he wouldn't have been able to vote. Now, because the right-wing coalition changed the law for him, he was able to do that. Fast forward a couple of years, now the Netanyahu government introduces and passes the Mofaz law. The Mofaz law was really a way of, at the time, making it easy for Shaul Mofaz and some of his followers to split from the then Tzipri-led Kadima. And the point of the Mofaz law was to really put a ceiling on the minimum number of MKs, members of Knesset, who are required for splitting. And the Mofaz law said that in the case of large political parties, even if you don't have 1/3, it's enough to have 7 members of that faction to vote. And the most recent amendment to the anti-defection package came as part of the 2014 governance law. And the 2014 governance law had a very important element which really spoke to the famous case of Chaim Amsalem, who left Shas and was able to actually draw on, under existing legislation, on party funding that allowed him to run and float his new political party in the next Knesset. But under the amendments brought in 2014, single members who split, even if their defection is not challenged, are not going to be able to draw on party funding for the next election. So the 2014 governance law just made it more difficult for defectors of any kind, single defectors of any kind, to form new political parties and run in the next election with state-provided money. In the next 2 slides, I just want to give you a sense of the numbers. So what were the main types of defections before the introduction of the anti-defection laws and since the introduction of the anti-defection laws? So the cutoff is really the 12th Knesset. So if you look at the last slide at the bottom of page 3, you will see at the top the information about the first 12 Knessets. And vertically, I just highlighted the main types of party hops and party switches that Israel has seen. So I counted the total number of 81 party hops or party switches, and they fall into the following 3 kinds. So there were 13 direct switches from one party to another, Isaac Harari, for example. 48 members of Knesset during the first 12 Knessets formed a new political party. So this would be, for example, Ben Gurion, who leaves Avodah and forms Rafi. And there were 12 instances of single MK defections. For example, Moshe Dayan, who leaves the Labour Party. And as a first move, as I mentioned before the next election, he actually formed a new political party. Since the introduction of the anti-defection law, so since the 13th Knesset, so that's a little bit shorter time period, you see that the number of hubs actually has slightly gone up. Not by much, but clearly it seems that the anti-defection laws certainly haven't resulted in a decline in party hubs and party switches. So there have been a total number of 84 switches since the first package of amendments were brought in. What's of course interesting but not surprising is that direct defections, the direct voluntaristic defections are gone. So there is, and that means that politicians, Israeli politicians, very clearly respond to the disincentive of the amendments introduced to the basic law of the Knesset. So we no longer see members of Knesset getting elected on one list and then during the term of that Knesset moving over to another list. Why? Because it's risky, because they may not be able to run in the next election. However, the number of MKs involved in forming new political parties almost doubled. So from 48 to 76. And if you see the number of single MK defections, single MK secessions, such as Haim Salem, they went down from 20 to 8.
Where'd they go? Single MKs?
They remain single MKs. There's a category called, think of them as independents. They become single MK, that's a particular category. And there's really no incentive. Sometimes a single MK can actually, if some of you might remember a former member of Knesset, Flato, who ran his own political party, but he was the only one on the list.
Well, it was that or prison.
It was that or prison, but
Friends.
the number of votes that he got actually entitled him to 2 seats. That's a problem. That only happened there. And only in Israel, to go back to Stanley. So if you turn to the next page, and that is a very important part of the story. It's not only, so the one conclusion that we can draw so far is that the number of defections really hasn't gone down, but we see that types of defections have changed. So there are more new party formation. So the number of MKs who are engaged in forming new political parties has gone up. If you look at the timing of defections, again, the temporal divide is exactly the same. If you see, during the first 5 Knessets, most members who switched did so midterm. And the number is 66. 66 is the number who members of Knesset who switched midterm and didn't get a cabinet payoff. If you look at the next number, there was another 6 who switched midterm and did receive a cabinet payoff. Now look to the last row at the bottom. 63 of the 84 switchers since the introduction of the laws switch in the last 101 days before the next election, so in the pre-electoral period. Right? So clearly the pattern that we see emerging is that Israeli politicians responding to these legal incentives tend to form, if they want to show disloyalty, they tend to form new political parties just in time for the next election to get them up and to get the parties up and running. Now, so clearly there are important consequences to take into account, and even though the inability or the lack of the law's bite to actually bring defections down is evident, it's also clear that the dynamics of Israeli elections has been affected by the anti-defection laws, because we do see, certainly politicians haven't become more faithful. What we do see is more and more new political parties being formed and offered to the Israeli voters on the electoral menu from election to election. I do want to end with just bringing and reminding you, because we do have friends from the legal profession around the table. I did want to make sure that I do put some of the legal implications and legal parts of the story also on the table and on the slide. Justice Barak was a very early advocate, if you will, against legislating against defections. And if you read the quote, this is what he says. A member of Knesset is not a representative of the political party. He's an organ of the state. He undertook to maintain allegiance to the state of Israel. He does not undertake to maintain allegiance to his party. Every member of Knesset is a representative of the entire nation. So the idea that parties should somehow increase and with the help of legislation increase their hold and ownership over their members, Barak was very much against. And he's not alone. If you look at, for example, European or international legal opinion, you look at the decision, not decisions, but views expressed and position papers from the Interparliamentary Union, the Council of Europe, the Venice Commission on Law and Democracy of the Council of Europe, you will see that Barak's view resonates exactly with that. Of course, it doesn't really, as I mentioned earlier, it doesn't really square with the institutional logic of a political system such as Israel's. Because if you vote according to political parties, and parties don't actually behave in a parliamentary fit fashion, if they don't vote together, then what does that say about accountability and representation? So that's a very important point there. Other than,
Did he just make that comment in a speech, or did he make that comment in a ruling in a case?
I can't answer, because this is, the quote is from Israeli Constitutional Politics volume, and I was trying to find whether this is actually a case ruling, and I couldn't. But hopefully by the end of the year I'll find that. Yeah. Now, however, what I'm turning to is actually three concrete cases where the Jerusalem District Court, which has jurisdiction over questions of party defections, actually made some very, very concrete interventions. The first one has to do with the yield case. And as I mentioned earlier, it was the court that ultimately told the Rabin government that the two yield ministers cannot be ministers unless the law is changed. And it was a very narrow ruling on a 5-member bench. It was a very narrow majority of 3-2, and a very, very difficult one, quite well publicized at the time. When Kadima was formed in 2006, the court also had to get involved, because when Shimon Peres, Daya Itzik, and Chaim Ramon indicate that they actually are interested in joining Kadima, and they want to join Kadima, and they don't see themselves running together with the Labour Party in the next election, the Labour Party doesn't go to the House Committee, which has the first say over these matters, but they actually go and contact the court. And the court said this: well, it's not clear whether they would be considered defectors. What would make the process clean, said the court, is the three of them quit the Knesset. The next election is coming up fairly soon. No major piece of legislation is going to be handled. Quit the Knesset. Everything is clear. We will allow you to run on the, if you so choose, still on the Kadima list, but you will not be considered defectors. No harm is done. But the court also put the Knesset on notice, saying this is unclear. You need to fix this moving forward. Hasn't been done yet, and in my interviews in the Knesset, it was very interesting to actually find that how this lack of clarity continues to give Knesset committees considerable headache. In the case of Michael Nudelman, essentially the same story applied. The court told Nudelman, an Ihud Leumi member of Knesset at the time, who also wanted to and expressed his desire to join Kadima, to do the same, leave the Knesset so that he would be able to do so. The Nudelman case actually was very interesting, and the protocols of that particular Knesset committee tell us a lot about how legislators think about the interpretation of the anti-defection laws. But I go into that if you are interested, but just to make sure that we finish kind of time, I will say. So in conclusion, let me just reiterate again that continued legal attempts at regulating party hopping really haven't brought down the number of instances of party switching. As we saw, more switches now take the form of the creation of new political parties in the pre-electoral period, which is now defined as 101 days. We do see that the anti-defection law every so often does bring the courts and the Knesset in better occasions into dialogue, on worse occasions into disagreement and conflict. And I do want to just leave you with this food for thought, and sometime in the next academic year, I'm hoping to give part 2 of this talk after my sabbatical is over, to actually make the argument that if you really want to, and if Israel is really serious about getting rid of defections, I think changing and taking a much more serious look at the electoral system is a much more promising way of doing that than tinkering with the various basic laws, finance law, and election law as it has been done so far. So I would actually advocate for a much more robust alteration of the closed-list party list system than which is in place right now. I'm going to stop. I spoke, as I promised I would speak for 30 minutes. It's clearly more than for 30 minutes. Please blame it on the fact that I'm on sabbatical and I haven't been teaching for the past and I'm still a professor who doesn't like to be quiet. So thank you so much. So questions, please. Sylvia, sorry, I think you were the first. And Jamal. No? Oh, okay, sorry. Sean.
Yeah, no, it's a very, very interesting. The point that Aaron Barak makes in the quote that you bring here is echoing a point that there's a very famous speech by Edmund Burke,
Yes.
a speech to the electors of Bristol,
That's right. Yeah.
that where he makes the same point, that as a member of British Parliament, I am responsible to my electors and I can switch parties. That works in the British or Canadian system, as you point out, because you're directly elected by a group. But when voters vote in Israel, you're not presented with a list with person for whom you're voting. You're simply presented with a 2-letter ticket for whom you're voting.
Yeah.
And so it's very hard to square Barak's comment with the reality of the system. Does the European legislation that you said his comment is based on, are those comments relevant to British systems or to proportional representation systems?
Both. So it's not specific, because the British type of electoral system is very, very unique. You don't have it anywhere else on the continent. Like Britain is the only European country that actually has a district-based election.
But all the Commonwealth countries have it.
Sorry?
All the Commonwealth.
Commonwealth, absolutely, yes. Now, what's very interesting, take for example Germany. The basic law of Germany is very much in line with Barak's statement here. The German parliament is elected half-half, it's a mixed electoral system. Half is closed list PR like Israel, the other half is like Britain, first past the post. And the basic law says that doesn't matter how you're elected to the Bundestag, the lower house of the parliament, once you're there, once an elected member is elected, there's no imperative mandate, no party discipline, nobody can actually give instructions to the member to behave in a particular way or not to behave. Of course, members of the Bundestag tend to be very, very disciplined, and to safeguard their careers, they actually do follow the party line. But to go back more theoretically to the question, there are a couple of very interesting positions that came down from the Venice Commission on Law and Democracy, which is an organ of the Council of Europe, which actually say that there is a conflict. There's a conflict between what we give primacy to, the accountability of the elected member to the voter, or the accountability of the elected member to the party. And the Interparliamentary Union also did studies on this, and they all converge on the same, that the responsibility to the electorate takes priority over the responsibility or the dependence of the member to the political party. Now, the Canadian Parliament, since 2004, the House of Commons has actually discussed this on a number of occasions. There were various bills put forward, and there was only one time when the House of Commons actually voted and actually came up on the order sheet, and then eventually there was a vote scheduled on the question. It was the NDP's electoral integrity legislation, and in the debates you saw the clash between those two arguments, and invariably with a very significant majority in the Canadian House, which is like the British system, came down on your side sort of the argument, saying that the party cannot come before, because what if the party's position changes, but my constituents' views don't change. Before ending the answer to that question, I do want to bring a very interesting example which also relates to this point, Sean. There was a gentleman whose name I mentioned on page 3 under the stinky trick or the stinking trick story, and that's Haim Perez, who was leader of the Shas at the time, who actually didn't vote with from Shas. So he was one who actually wanted to remain loyal to the Shamir government. And the party demanded that because he doesn't follow, that he should step down. And what he said resonated with something that Moshe Dayan also said back in '77, when his labor colleagues in the Labour Party demanded that he should give up his seat in the Knesset. Both of them said the following: "You owe me more than I owe you." The reason why many people on the list got into the Knesset is because my face is visible for the electorate. People know me as Dayan. Perez said the same thing. People know me in the community much more than some of these junior members on the Shas list. I got more votes for the party, so if anything, you owe me. You depend on me. I don't depend on you. It was a bit more difficult to perhaps swallow in the Shas case. Dayan perhaps had a more compelling story to tell because he was already internationally a very, very exposed person. But it's interesting to see how politicians tinker and play with these arguments. Yeah. So it's it.
Oh, okay. What I'm seeing in the table that you offered is that since the 1992, actually, it's not really surprising, is that you see the decline of the party. I mean, now from now on, every time that a party started losing in the polls, starts to lose its ground, its politicians, whoever has any stand, will run for another one. You saw with Shinui, they had 15. Sharon established Kadima, Shinui disappeared by night. And everyone who could escape anywhere, they did. Okay, back to the Likud, into Kadima, where. So this is part of the story. Of course, it is very significant that it happened just before the election, which is when you have a reshuffle. It's actually logical to do that if you have that. But perhaps a broader question, perhaps a more statistical one. Do you know how long the defectors of any kind survive after the defection? I mean, there are those who definitely have a stand, a political stand, and they can run on and on wherever they are. You have those who are quite unique. Let's say even Nachman Shai, who started with Kadima, defected to the library. He was elected twice into the parliament. So others disappeared. Who remembers them? So
very important question. And let me start in not a convoluted way, but let me start in a way that adds perhaps another interesting point to it. There's a very interesting type of coalition that defectors form. And the Barak case actually, the formation of Hatzmot actually very nicely illustrates that. Typically, these defecting groups tend to take the shape of having a couple of one or two, depending on the case, depending on the numbers, very high profile, very visible, powerful leaders. And to buttress, make sure the numbers are there, some very lower ranked members of the party. The latter tend to be washed out, and sometimes even the former. The stats and the numbers shows it, and I didn't bring that with me, but it's very, very clear that in Israel, like in most other countries that we have information about, and that is where party switching is studied, it doesn't pay to defect in terms of the future legislative and political career of the given politician. So if you look at, for example, the politicians who joined Tzipi Livni in forming Hatnuah, they didn't do very well. I mean, Shetrit, yes, but others didn't. If you look at the Barak case again, well, Hassanul didn't even bother running in the next election because clearly that wasn't viable. And if you look at these 165 MKs who have defected in one way or another, the percentage of those who continued for just one more term is very, very small. And that's not so it doesn't pay to defect.
But that's different in a British system, right?
Well, it can be, and it typically is. In the district system, normally you defect to protect the constituency, and the constituency then, yeah. But it doesn't have to work that way. But it can work that way.
Actually, very often in that kind of situation, the defector usually goes as an independent first, then joins another political party. But very often the voters in that constituency wanted the candidate from that party, And very often, one who defects doesn't win again with his new party in the same district.
There's a very interesting series of studies about Southern American congressmen. And there it's also very clear. There's a couple of recent studies by a local young political scientist actually, locally trained from the University of Montreal, and he finds the same thing. It doesn't, the electoral consequences of defecting are negative. And it's statistically significant there too. Jamal, sorry.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, sorry, Sylvia. No. Sorry.
I thank you very much. First of all, I couldn't help but notice that politicians everywhere are the same. Everyone is a political animal. Everybody's engaged in horse trading and pragmatic. However, I pointed two things that you mentioned. One is more important to me is that this almost started with the first Knesset. This is not a new phenomenon. So I'm quite tempted to think that this predates the mechanics of the electoral law or the framework. It has to do with socialization, I mean, political socialization, that is. The fact that these members of Knesset represent probably diverse groups who vote by smaller bloc interests. Therefore, the switching of sides is a reflection probably of that. I'm very skeptical about like a bold stroke kind of reform being able to stop that. And my other question is, since you say that the numbers, the odds are against any defector ever retaining, if these are smart political animals, and they are, why do they engage in it so much? If it doesn't pay off, it only pays off in the very immediate. In the long run, why would they engage in it?
So let me answer both, but I want to do it carefully because the full answer, and it's not a cop-out, but you can take it as a cop-out, but the full answer to the second question, I'm really hoping, I'm actually working towards a theory of, a behavioral theory of defections, which I think once the study is complete can actually corroborate what you just, the answer to your second question, Csaba. But to go back to the first question, absolutely, and if you study the history of the Zionist movement, the Zionist congresses, I mean, did those parties stick to it? No, I mean, defections, the splits were rampant throughout, and but also in the Yishuv, so prior to the creation of the state. So yes, in a fragmented society, in a religiously, ethnically, ideologically fragmented society, certainly you do see these tendencies to happen. Part of the reason why I think that the electoral system that Israel has is perhaps problematic, although there were good reasons why Israel adopted this electoral system, precisely because it creates inclusion. Right? It was very important to create a low threshold PR system when Israel was created, A, because PR was really the system that the Zionist organization used, but B, it really is a system that doesn't exclude any major political constituency. And when you create the Zionist, the Jewish state, where different groups are coming together, it's very important to be inclusive. But part of the incentive structure of this electoral system is that it doesn't restrain political entrepreneurs. So it's very easy to split away and forth.
Just to follow through, and the design of the system was to be inclusive to everyone, with the hopes, I think, I don't know, you correct me, of creating eventually, of molding a greater national, or no, was it? Because I think this, at the beginning, might have been self-evident and very smart because you're including everyone, but by the end of the day, it perpetuates these smaller factional politics. It does not create this greater mass where you're critically moving towards a greater consolidation of political interests, etc. I don't know. I mean,
well, let me finish the second question and then try to come back to the third, Jamal. So the question is, okay, so why do smart Israeli politicians defect if electorally it doesn't pay? So I think you have to ask the question, so who tend to be the kinds of people who defect? And there is really a curvilinear story going on. Most defectors tend to be either early on in their careers when if they defect and they don't come back, they still have many, many career options. Or at the end. Right? If you have been Moshe Dayan, you've seen it all, you've done it all. So you defect, you don't come back, all right. So, and mid-career politicians are the ones that are very careful about not rocking the boat too much. Because if indeed they defect and the electoral consequences are negative, it's, you already gave a considerable amount of your time and your political time and your time to the party. So that's so the risk is greater midterm. So to answer the question, and that's really these are the skeleton of the theory that that I'm seeking to corroborate, and that I think answers the sense of creating a less fragmented Israeli national identity. Well, you could find some evidence maybe in just thinking about politicians. In Ben Gurion's notion of mamlaktiyut, like the stateness of Israel and why we need that, and the sort of the nation forging program of that particular discourse and strategy. But even there, I think there's a fundamental recognition of the multiplicity and the diversity of the Jewish world. So I think that that's a constant. That fluidity is a constant.
Yeah, but more than that, there was a sense of stability. Until the late 1990s, there was stability. In the 1990s, the whole system crashed. But because of the direct election. But before that, even if Ben Gurion needed to resign and the next morning have established a new government, he did it with the same prime minister, virtually the same government. So there was stability even if you had these tiny factions around.
So the Americanization of the political
In a way, yeah. In a way. And that's only 1990s onward.
Yeah.
So in our system, the constituent system, you have accountability to the constituents. In the PR system, you have accountability of a sort to the people who voted for the electoral list. But we know the problems with PR. No system's perfect. Has there been discussion in Israel about a mixed system like they have in Germany?
Yes. And in fact, if you look at some of the main propositions, the main alternatives that have been entertained for Israeli electoral reform, the mixed system from quite early on actually has been very closely looked at, but there has been no political support for it. But you do see people, scholars, intellectuals associated, for example, with the Israeli Democracy Institute, thinking about these questions along these lines. Now, the mixed electoral system, I do want to say, is no panacea. And there are many different ways in which you can design a mixed electoral system. The German version seems to have worked well in terms of creating strong parties and creating stable governments. The Hungarian version seems to have created two strong parties, two stable governments. The Lithuanian version has done neither. The Lithuanian version of the mixed electoral system has created very weak political parties and weak governments. And it's also part of, and in fact, two very important political scientists at the Hebrew University, Gideon Rahat and Reuven Hazan, wrote a very important couple of studies sort of telling the Israeli case about thinking about mixed electoral systems in a volume that came out about this question about 12, 13 years ago, something like that. They argued that the direct election of the prime minister that Ziv mentioned was actually a way of introducing a unique mixed system to Israel, right? Because all of a sudden you had an election to the Knesset and you were directly also electing the prime minister. But that's not, of course, the German version. So put that aside. But in that volume, if you look at the list of countries that have had mixed electoral systems and look at the life cycle, if you will, or what actually happened to these electoral systems, they haven't performed all that well. Ukraine, Russia, they are moved away from their mixed electoral systems. Japan, Mexico, Italy went back to PR. So mixed electoral systems about in the 1990s when there was a whole number of new democracies, largely in Eastern Europe, everybody was very excited. Let's emulate Germany. That in particular the Hungarians and the Lithuanians very much wanted that. 20 years later, the record of these systems is not all that compelling. So something made it work in Germany, that doesn't seem to travel as well across. But having said that, when you look at some of the main alternatives, and Gidi Rahat wrote a very important, very thick volume about the history of electoral reforms in Israel. He looks at this, and you can see very clearly that the German model was considered, but there's no. Ben-Gurion, of course, was a proponent of the British system. And in fact, he leaves Avodah and creates Rafi. That's one of the central electoral plaques that he's running in the next election. He wanted to push for that electoral system, but couldn't, and there has been no. The system is too inclusive for a major electoral reform. Everybody's benefiting from this system, so who is there to support change?
The voters.
But they are not the ones making the law. Right? So that you're absolutely right, Sean. But so you either open up for a referendum or a constituent assembly, but then the Knesset would need to allow or would want to share that kind of power. So Simon, sorry.
No, just but when a system is entrenched, and I go back to your point of the political culture, when you look at the American elections today, Trump and Cruz are not Republicans, and Bernie Sanders is not a Democrat. So you have 3 out of the 4 main people who are running who have nothing to do with the party that they're running for, but it's just the American system that demands 2 large parties, and you can't. Whoever runs an independent is sure not to win. Therefore, you have the fringe who are just latching on to one of the big political parties, which doesn't. Where they have absolutely no place in both sides. So it's. You have to ask the question because you recall it.
So I think Stan. Oh, seriously?
So, I have no question.
I'm sorry, everybody
I
keeps
came to
pointing to me. I'm
learn.
so sorry.
I'm listening.
Stanley, yours is I think that's the last question. Then if no.
It's not so much a question, actually, it's the follow-up of what you were saying that we were discussing roughly before, and it brings us up to the point of in Canada, Justin made a famous statement that the next election will not be fought on the same system as we have now. I mean, that sounds totally ludicrous to me. I mean, in the next 3 years right now, to change the whole system without even, and no discussion even taking place.
Are you on a first name basis with the Prime Minister?
No, but I just think that, I think he's not, to me, he's not more
It's
than.
very hard for people of our generation to come through.
Even of a little younger generation. So I can imagine how much more difficult it would be in Israel, but you're saying that their system originally in Israel started because this was the Zionist Congress had the system?
The literature identifies 3 main reasons why Israel started out with this electoral system. One has to do with the historical legacy, that it's a very inclusive system. The Zionist Congresses all used it to elect the various national delegations, so it was known, it worked. Second, if you actually look at the UN resolution that partitions the mandate, the resolution actually calls for the legislatures of the 2 new entities to be elected by proportional representation. And Israel from the beginning has been true to that. And the third has to do, and of course it didn't have to be this way, but the third important reason has to do with war.
With?
War. Israel is born, what happens day after? Israel is at war. How do you draw districts? How do you determine the voters list? It's very difficult. The easiest way of running an election was this. One constituency, closed list, 2 letters, 1 letter on the ballot, that's it. And it has stuck.
Persisted, yeah.
So those are the 3 dominant explanations that we have. And I haven't found anything else. I mean,
but the country is divided in terms of
regions,
municipalities, zoning.
The British,
those can be used
British
as
regions are
rivals.
still there.
Sorry?
The British districts.
Yes.
The British are still existing for all kinds of administrative.
Yes,
reasons.
administrative, yes.
But not
Yeah,
political.
but not political. And remember the soldiers, like all of a sudden you're mobilized. Where do you live? Where are you registered? But where are you actually on the day of polling? Like it just creates the administration of that district-based election under the constraints of war was just like it's one thing for us to think back and imagine this in 2016, but there and then it was a very, very different story. And I was hoping to challenge that conventional wisdom and find something other than this. But no, it actually seems to be quite well substantiated by the discussions that took place then. Simon, to answer your question, yes, there are regions you could create, and that's another important alternative proposition to go back to electoral reforms. You could have 5-6 multi-member districts in Israel. Like you could keep the Knesset at 120, use the main regional divisions, each representing a variable number of representatives. But of course, then you would have to look at the population dynamics. Right? So which community will you be more splitting when you introduce these boundaries?
And the gerrymandering will come into being right away. People will talk about it immediately, how many votes, how many electors here, and how many electors here, why not?
Okay,
So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming. This